Honored guests, lend me your ears. Long has our Fevrimon suffered, without a true monarch to guide her and her people.
Dragon's Dogma is a game that I didn't play when it originally came out. In fact, I had never even heard of the game till like a few years ago. I don't really remember how I heard of it, I just remember discovering it. But as it turns out, it seems like that was most people. It was never a game that I necessarily fell in love with, but I did have a soft spot for it, and definitely thought that an IP like Dragon's Dogma had a lot of potential as a franchise as opposed to just a one-off. So Dragon's Dogma 2 gets announced and comes out 12 years later, like after the original game was released. And I was really excited to play it because leading up to its release, the trailers made the game look better and better. And after playing it, I almost want to say that this is a very good game that lives up to the original, and it is, with some issues that come really close to ruining it for me, but don't quite ruin it for me. Was that complicated? Let's explain. Hi guys, MiiKcast here reviewing today Dragon's Dogma 2. Now before we get started, you know what to do. Be sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell, leave a comment, or I will make you fight a giant dragon, and good luck! Starting off with the good, the best and most positive word I can use to describe Dragon's Dogma 2 is massive. This game is huge in scale, scope, monetization, but in all seriousness, this is the type of open world game that we rarely get. And I'm talking similar to games like Elden Ring and Tears of the Kingdom, where maybe you don't get as much freedom as you do in those games, but there is no particular order that you need to play this game, kind of. I mean, it's not like you can fight the final boss at the beginning of the game like you can in like Elden Ring and Tears of the Kingdom. And if you can, I didn't know that, but you don't have to follow any sort of order to play the game. Sure, some quests get unlocked after you complete others, but it still gives you a sense of freedom that I love. And more on the open world itself, it is huge. One of the biggest, in fact, I feel. Even 20 hours in and I'm still discovering new areas of the map, with so much more to do. I'm also not much of a side quests guy, but I found myself doing a lot of the side quests in Dragon's Dogma 2. And a lot of them, in addition to the main quests, make this world feel breathed in and lived in. It feels believable and also somewhat true to the time period with the dialogue, which I also thought was a nice touch. Now, the way Dragon's Dogma 2 sets itself apart from other fantasy action RPGs is that in DD2, and also the first game, but we're talking about the second game, so in DD2, there are pawns that you can have following you around. In case you don't know, your pawn is an AI that pretty much serves as your second player, and there are other NPCs throughout the game that you can hire as your pawn, or recruit them as your pawn, really. You can have up to 3 pawns, which makes up your party of 4. One party member, of course, is yourself, and another party member is your main pawn, and the other 2 can be NPCs you find. I always like this idea because it makes a lot of the NPCs feel more important. I'd say like 80% of the NPCs you see in this game, you can recruit them into your party and they'll have some cool abilities. And about those abilities, in the game they are called vocations. When you create your character, and I'll get to that part in a little bit, you have the option between 4 vocations. Fighter, which is the all-round swordsman, pretty much. Archer, which I don't really need to explain that one. Mage, which I also don't really need to explain. And Thief, which seems to be like a faster fighter. Those are the vocations at the start, but you can unlock more as you go along, and even meet other pawns with different vocations. It's really cool, and you can also change your vocation throughout the game. I mainly stuck with Fighter because I'm a basic bitch, but it's still pretty neat. I realize though that I haven't really talked about the gameplay that much, so I guess I'll do that now. Starting off with the combat, it feels like Dark Souls meets Monster Hunter, and I'd say that the combat in particular leans more towards the latter. When you fight enemies, there could be a lot of them, and they'll pop up a lot, especially at night, but the combat feels nice. Nothing too crazy good about it, but I like it. Same goes with going from point A to point B. in between combat. However, what makes this game go so crazy is when you get a random ass boss fight. You see, Dragon's Dogma 2 has boss fights, of course, but they aren't your typical boss fights. Most games have you progress to a boss fight, but DD2 has you traversing the world and a giant boss fight just appears and you gotta fight it. It can range from a giant cyclops to a giant wolf to a giant eagle, or griffin as it's called in the game. They can just pop up out of nowhere and you just gotta be prepared because you never know when they decide to show up. That's another thing about this game. It is tough, but not particularly in the way you might think. It's not like these bosses or hordes of enemies are OP or anything like that. You just have to be prepared. And sure, you could run away from them. Even boss fights you can run away from. And that is something I kind of had to do. Like, I had no choice but to do that in a few instances. But it makes Dragon's Dogma 2 a game where you really have to strategize. As for other things I liked, the customization options are crazy, specifically like when you customize your own character. I noticed that Capcom has had some crazy character creators in their games, and although I took mine somewhat seriously, I noticed a lot of people online making some weird and funny creations. You can create your own character and then create your pawn. Dragon's Dogma 2 is also visually stunning. Sure, there are some serious performance issues that I'll get to later, but when it's running well, it looks amazing. And lastly, I really like the music. I don't think it's anything too memorable, but it's good. Moving on to the mixed aspects of Dragon's Dogma 2, I found myself very mixed on one big thing that might hurt the game a little for me, but other stuff that didn't bother me too awfully much, but I am including it in the mixed. One thing is the story. It's not that it does anything particularly wrong, it just doesn't really feel that important when playing. And I was kind of surprised by that, but when I was playing the game, I found myself coming back for the experience and the interactions and the combat, but not so much the story. I don't know, that's just me. I'm a sucker for a good video game story, as I would assume most people are, but this one was kind of just there. It's not even bad, it was just there, I feel. Another thing that I'm mixed on, and this might ruffle a few feathers because it's in the mixed and not in the bad, but it's the microtransactions. I'm sure you've heard all about the controversy with Dragon's Dogma 2 and its microtransactions, and on the one hand, I get it and actually agree that this game should not have microtransactions, especially since we expect this type of bullshit from companies like EA, Activision, Ubisoft, and Konami, and not so much Capcom. But on the other hand, you really gotta search for the microtransactions in this game. Had it not blown up the way it did, I would have gone through this entire game without knowing that there were microtransactions. But the thing is, these microtransactions are things that you unlock while playing the game, and they do make the game easier, and since there is no difficulty select, some of these microtransactions somewhat replace an easy mode, if you know what I mean. It's a slippery slope, and I honestly believe they should have just added an easy mode instead of monetizing things that would make the game easier, but at the same time, it doesn't really affect the actual game, you know? For example, there isn't really fast travel in this game. That's just how Dragon's Dogma works. There are certain, like, crystals that you collect that could work as a fast travel sort of thing, but there's not really a fast travel feature. There's a fast travel item. But you could purchase, with real money, more of these fast travel crystals, which makes the game easier, trust me. But you don't have to do that. And lastly, Dragon's Dogma 2 has aspects that just aren't for me. I know I mentioned earlier how it was pretty cool with the enemies popping up out of nowhere, and it was at times for me, but at a certain point, I just wanted to finish my quest, and I can't because there are just too many enemies. Again, it's cool that you kind of gotta, like, strategize, you gotta, you know, be wise, be smart, be on edge, that, like, any enemy or boss can pop up at any time, but at some points, it was just too much, I felt.
Oi! Who goes there? Who's there? tut. Now, this just won't do.
Moving on to the bad, there are two big issues I have. One somewhat big issue, and then two very minor issues that don't ruin the game, but I'm an expert at bitching, so I'll mention them anyways. And starting with the minor issues, I mentioned how I thought the dialogue being more like how people spoke from the time period was a nice touch. And while it is, there is also text that you have to read at times, and they read exactly like the dialogue, and it doesn't work as well, I feel. And it's not just random character dialogue, it's actually tips that the game gives you. It's very minor and something I shouldn't be mentioning, but it's my video. I can mention whatever I want. Another minor issue I had is, well, I died a lot, of course, because this is a challenging game. That's not my issue. My issue is not that I died a lot. But what I found kind of annoying and really weird is obviously when you die, one of the options the game gives you is to respawn from the last checkpoint, of course. But for whatever reason, nothing actually happens until you click on it like 5 times. Like, it will become unresponsive for like a good 5 seconds. It's ultimately nothing, but, you know, dying doesn't feel good, and this felt like insult to injury. Should I have even included this? This might get cut. Or maybe it doesn't. Be pretty funny if it doesn't get cut. And I'm saying this in the video. Moving on to my somewhat big issue, there's only one save slot. Like, every time you save, it overwrites your last save. In most games, you have the option to do a different save slot and not overwrite your last save, but this one overwrites your last save. And it's also weird because you can manually save in Dragon's Dogma 2, but you can't load to that save? What? That's so weird. What the huh? Another issue I have, and we're getting to the bigger issues, and along with the microtransactions, you may have heard some controversy around this, and that's the performance. I've heard mostly PC players complain about the performance, but I played on PS5, and at times, the game struggles. Especially when you have a full party of 4 people, including yourself, plus other NPCs that help you out, which is something I forgot to mention, but other NPCs will help you out during fights. While fighting a giant horde of enemies with a big-ass boss, all at the same time, which, yes, that does happen a lot in this game, the game chugs like crazy. And I know Capcom released a performance patch recently, but that doesn't excuse the poor performance. And lastly, while it didn't take too long for the game to click with me, something that I feel like would be the case for most people if you didn't play the first game, for a while, it didn't feel like I was progressing, like, at all. I know this is a cop-out, but I can't quite tell you why I felt this way, but for a good 80% of the game, it just felt like I was doing quests. They were fun, you know. In fact, I think I might have found the quests of, like, you know, doing this thing, retrieving this item, maybe more fun than fighting enemies, if I'm going to be honest. But they didn't feel like main quests because they didn't feel like they moved the game forward. There were barely any story cutscenes, which is probably why the story didn't feel as important. They just sort of happened, you know? That's just me, though. Throughout my playthrough of Dragon's Dogma 2, I honestly kept flip-flopping. There were times where I thought this could be possibly my game of the year, and I give FF7 Remake a 10 out of 10, so this could have been better than that. But then there were legitimately other times where I thought I was going to put the game down and never pick it back up again. And there are many things that hurt the game. Stuff like the poor performance, the lack of another save slot, the weird pacing of the game, and the enemies becoming a bit too much to handle. They all bothered me, but they all feel like just not enough to ruin the game, if that makes sense. Dragon's Dogma 2 has a massive open world with so many options and fun quests, and is visually beautiful. And the boss fights are out of this world. And they don't even necessarily feel like traditional boss fights, because they're not traditional boss fights. And I feel like all this outweigh the bad and the mixed aspects, in my personal opinion. So in the end, I'm going to give Dragon's Dogma 2 an 8 out of 10. And maybe what I said lines up more with the 7, but I do believe this game deserves an 8. So this was my review for Dragon's Dogma 2. What do you guys think about this one? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, or I will put you up against a dragon. And good luck with that.